I started the McLuhan Institute in 2017, basically because it didn't exist. You know, my grandfather, Marshall McLuhan, had basically invented a field of study, an approach to exploring and understanding the nature and effects of technologies, a very particular kind of way of doing things. My father, Eric, had started working with him in the mid-'60s and worked very, very closely with him. What they had started deserved to be preserved and maintained, and nobody was doing that.
Welcome to the Education Matters podcast. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri, and today's conversation is one that feels deeply personal and really important. My guest is Andrew McLuhan, grandson of Marshall McLuhan and son of Eric McLuhan. As the founder and director of the McLuhan Institute, Andrew is carrying forward a unique intellectual, or perhaps I should say perceptual, lineage. If you've been following this podcast, you know that I see education as the foundation of collective thought and group agency, the very thing that shapes how we think, communicate, and engage with the world. Public education isn't just another system. It's the most vital institution that we have to safeguard democracy and build a world worth living in. And much of my understanding of its significance has been shaped by the work of Marshall McLuhan, who I believe is the greatest Canadian public intellectual. He was a writer, philosopher, and poet of media, and one of the most important thinkers of the 20th century, if not of all time. But Marshall McLuhan wasn't just a scholar, he was a cultural force. In the 1960s and 70s, he was everywhere, shaping the way we think about media and technology. He coined phrases like the medium is the message and the global village, ideas that predicted the internet in ways that would reshape human behavior decades before they became reality. His influence extended far beyond academia. Rock stars and filmmakers sought him out. John Lennon once visited him in Toronto asking when the revolution was coming, to which McLuhan reportedly quipped, "You've already missed it," referring, of course, to the electric revolution. Woody Allen even immortalized him in Annie Hall, where McLuhan himself is pulled into a debate about his work. But despite all the attention that McLuhan purposely attracted, he loved to work in teams. And his closest collaborator was his son, Eric McLuhan. Eric carried forward this intellectual tradition, expanding and refining ideas about media, environments, and perception. But Eric wasn't just someone whose work I studied and admired, though I certainly did. He became my mentor and, truthfully, one of my heroes. I first met Eric through another great Canadian writer, B.W. Powell, who himself was a former student of Marshall McLuhan and also a friend of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He's a brilliant thinker in his own right, and his fascinating story will be the focus of a future Education Matters episode. But anyway, Bruce told me that Eric was looking for an assistant to catalog Marshall's personal library, and I obviously jumped at the opportunity. It didn't take long to realize I wasn't particularly suited for the job, because every book I opened to catalog led to hours-long conversations with Eric, and to my surprise, Eric didn't seem to mind at all. I never actually got work done, and he just loved the questions and the discussion. As for the actual cataloging, well, that's where today's story starts. The work I started was later completed by today's guest, who not only saw it through, but ensured the collection was properly preserved at the University of Toronto's Thomas Fisher Rare Books Library, which is available to view for the general public. Andrew wasn't formally trained in literary studies and philosophy like his father and grandfather, and so he didn't initially see himself as part of the McLuhan tradition. But as Andrew will describe in our conversation, in his 30s, something clicked. He immersed himself in his grandfather's personal library, studied alongside Eric, and found himself drawn into the same kind of media and poetic exploration that defined his family's legacy. And without a doubt, Andrew embodies the same visionary qualities that make Eric and Marshall's work so vital today. In our conversation, we explore the origins of thinking like a McLuhan, the contributions of Eric McLuhan in his father's work, the crucial difference between media literacy and media ecology, and the ways in which our technology or media shape not just what we know, but how we know and how we think. We also discuss Andrew's personal journey, how he came to embrace his role in carrying forward his family's legacy, and how he translates their powerful ideas to a new generation of artists, tech entrepreneurs, and students. This is a conversation about technology, education, and perception. But more than that, it's a conversation about what it means to explore the environments we create and inhabit at a time when this is more important than ever. And now, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Andrew McLuhan. Okay, Andrew, thank you for joining the podcast. At this point, I would have given you a proper introduction, but maybe we can start with tell me, first of all, where does this podcast find you?
Well, this podcast finds me in Picton, Ontario, at my mom's house because my place, the McLuhan Institute, is picturesquely situated between farms, which is lovely for a setting, not so much for an internet connection. So on occasion, when I need a stronger internet signal, I come in here in town. The internet we have is just good enough for most things, and I kind of like it that way. Just good enough, because if it was that much better, I might be encouraged to do more things, and I'd rather spend my time doing other things sometimes.
Well, I've spent a good amount of time there in your workshop / laboratory / library, and maybe we'll get into that. But that what you just said reminds me of something your father told me once around tech, and he said, "Keep it weird, keep it weird." Yeah. Meaning, at least I understood it to mean, keep a little bit at a distance. Don't be so familiar with it that it becomes the environment. So I remember that often. Keep it weird. Learn about the stuff, but use it, but keep it weird.
I like that.
Yeah, always stuck with me. So, and maybe we can get into a bit of that in the work that I did with Eric McLuhan several years ago. But let's start with you. Can you give the audience a brief overview about yourself and your work?
Sure. Well, what's to say? I kind of came at the work later in my life. In my early education, I wasn't that much interested in it, honestly. So I finished high school, and that was even a near thing, but I finished. And I didn't have any desire to go to college or university, really. I just kind of went off and did my own thing and lived life. But it so happened that, in my early 30s, I tried to read my family's work when I was younger, when I was a teenager in my 20s, and it just didn't really do anything for me, probably because I didn't understand very much of it at all, see what the big deal was. It just didn't spark anything in me. And oddly enough, for whatever reason, in my early 30s, what happened was my dad needed somebody to go on a trip with him, a speaking trip, and my mom didn't really want to go. So I was definitely interested in a free trip to Europe. And I went with my dad. And for whatever reason, listening to him give his talk, it made sense for, I think, the first time in my life. And that was that pivotal moment, because, when something finally clicks and catches your interest and imagination and understanding, that's a captivating, seductive even thing. So it was all downhill from there. I mean, I just started getting more involved and trying to learn and understand more, and did more and more things. I spent a year and a half studying my grandfather's library, and after that, just kept learning. And I found that I wanted to share what I'd been learning, and sharing it and writing it and teaching it, redigesting it, helped me understand it more. And it's gotten to the point where I kind of do it as my full-time job now, which is great.
Amazing. So can you maybe describe the McLuhan Institute that you've set up?
Yeah. I started the McLuhan Institute in 2017, basically because it didn't exist. My grandfather, Marshall McLuhan, had basically invented a field of study, an approach to exploring and understanding the nature and effects of technologies, a very particular kind of way of doing things. My father, Eric, had started working with him in the mid-'60s and worked very, very closely with him, as close as you can work with somebody who's not yourself, really. They would complete each other's sentences. They were that on the same wavelength. And when Marshall died in 1980, my father just kept going on his own. He wasn't really gainfully employed by universities or anything like that. He didn't have a formal institute or anything. And I realized around 2017 that what they had started deserved to be preserved and maintained. And nobody was doing that. Universities, colleges have media studies programs, and there might even be McLuhan experts or something. But nothing was in place to keep that tradition alive. So I started the McLuhan Institute in order to try and keep that strain of studies as close to the source and pure as possible. This many years later, 7 years later, I guess, it's kind of working, which is a wonderful thing.
Excellent. So, I love the work that you're doing, and
thank you.
Certainly the work of your grandfather and father, and we're going to get into this a bit. But let's start with you. Where and when did you grow up?
Well, I kind of had two childhoods. So I was born and raised in Toronto, and I lived there until I was about 17, 18 years old, when my parents had decided to move to the country. They'd kind of gotten sick of Toronto and wanted a change. And because, as I mentioned, I didn't care about school too much, I had a year of high school left to do. So I moved out to the country because I knew if I stayed in the city and got a job in an apartment, I knew myself well enough to know I probably wouldn't finish high school, and I wanted to do at least that. So I moved to the country. This area, Prince Edward County, is about 2.5 hours drive east of Toronto. Not knowing anybody here, I enrolled in the local high school, got on a school bus every day, which was I'd been used to taking the subway and bus and streetcar to school. So to get on a school bus at 18 was kind of a crazy thing to do.
For the first time, really?
And going to school in a small town of like 4,000 people, where the minute I showed up, everybody knew who I was or thought they did. And I spent the rest of my time there trying to figure out who anybody else was, right? It was a real, education, learning experience to go from growing up in a very urban center to a very rural center. And I feel like it was my second, not exactly childhood, obviously, because I was, practically an adult, but I feel like I grew up a second time living out here in the country. And, in the year and whatever it took me to finish high school, I fell in love with the place. I met some great people, kind of fell out of touch with my Toronto friends, and I'm still here. So
I am fascinated by what the upbringing of a McLuhan is like. And I know you have siblings and cousins, so this obviously could vary. But, take me back to when you were a kid, maybe in Toronto.
Yeah.
Like, what do you remember about, even the informal education? You've already stated that the formal education didn't feel ever right for you. But what was the informal education like, and what kind of things were you encouraged to do as a younger child?
Well, it's an interesting thing. So that's funny because I haven't really been asked this question before, but growing up McLuhan was a strange thing, because, at a certain age, I began to understand that my grandfather was someone that people knew, and that was a weird thing, right? People didn't know who my friends' grandparents were, right? But somehow people knew who my granddad was. So that was odd. And just the company my dad, my parents kept, intellectuals, thinkers, all kinds of people, really, not just, it wasn't some intellectual party all the time or anything.
But artists,
thinkers, people of all sorts.
And I know your dad had a lot of friends that were, and himself, a handy guy. So I could certainly see how he had a good eclectic mix of folks.
very eclectic, and it made for an interesting home life, which was great,
Mm.
and was just normal for me. But I had a very different upbringing, similar but different from my father. My dad
Mm-hmm.
was the oldest of six kids, and the eldest son, and it was a very traditional conservative family, and he was kind of raised to be, mini Marshall.
Mm.
His education was very formal, uh, at a convent, at learning from nuns at one point, and
Mm.
Greek and Latin, and very much the professor's son.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I feel that I think my dad was very aware of being so specifically raised, and gave me as much leeway as he could to find my own way,
Mm.
which
Mm.
is something I didn't realize till much later. But when I
Mm-hmm.
did, I made sure to mention to him how much I appreciated that. And the funny thing is that I think my dad kind of ran away and joined the Air Force at 18 because he was born in the U.S. And he was obsessed with model airplanes as a kid. And I think he wanted to get away from all that stuff. So
Standard rebellion.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So he went away, ran away, and joined the Air Force. But then he came back and started working with his
Mm-hmm.
dad anyway.
Mm-hmm.
For me, I was kind of raised, I feel, to find my own way. Um, and despite all odds, I ended up doing this anyway. So it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
funny. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
nature or nurture, I don't know. I guess it's a bit of both. In my case, I came to it much later, but
Mm-hmm.
I also come at it very differently. It was when my dad went the full academic route, getting all the degrees, including
Mm-hmm.
honorary degrees, but his full PhD in English literature. Um, I barely graduated high school, and very informally educated.
Mm-hmm.
So once I started getting interested in the work, I used to run an upholstery shop. I recovered people's furniture for about 10
Mm-hmm.
years, just a one-man shop. And it was in the barn beside my dad's office. So I could go out there and be working on a chair or whatever, and then go next door and talk to dad for a bit, fill up my head basically to capacity, and then go work it out.
Mm-hmm.
And while I'm working on chairs, doing very physical things, my mind is digesting it all. And it was great because I could just go back and forth, and that allowed me a lot of flexibility. I never studied full time with him or anything, just
Mm-hmm.
kind of, as I was interested, as time allowed. And I think that was the way that felt most natural to me. So I come at it from a very different way. I'm not classically educated, and my interests, um, you know, I come at things very poetically because I've been interested in poetry since as long as I can remember,
Mm-hmm.
uh, composing and writing and performing poetry.
Mm.
And that sensibility or way of relating to the world, and relating to other people, informs how I approach the work as well, and gives me, I think, it's a different approach anyway, but I think it's still very much in line with the family way of doing
Oh, I
things.
was going to say very McLuhan-esque way of approaching things for sure.
But the fun, like, I didn't set out to do it, I really have just followed my heart and my interests, and it's led me here anyway, which is kind of funny.
Speaking of the heart and interest, what was the first thing you remembered loving to learn?
Well, the first thing that I can remember capturing my imagination and wanting to look into on my own outside of school, I got this book on the Crusades, and I was obsessed. So the whole knights in armor thing, but then also like the esoteric side of things, and Templars and Masons and all that just really lit up my imagination. But on the reverse side of that, I remember very accurately when I lost interest in school. because there was a precipitating event, and I had this. I'm not going to name her because, bless her, I'm sure she meant well. But I had a grade 3 teacher who we were doing a unit on poetry. And remember, I loved poetry, right? Poetry was words, playing with words was my thing. And the assignment that she'd given us was she'd copied out a poem, a short poem, 4 or 8 lines or something on the board, blackboard, and you were supposed to copy it onto paper and hand it in. So it was written down in verse, and I wrote it down paragraph style. So not in the same form. And I handed it in, and she said, that's wrong, and gave it back to me without any explanation, right? Like figure it out. So I figured maybe I made some mistakes. I recopied it the same way. And this went on a few times. I don't remember exactly how it ended, but I just remember that it killed something inside me. And I think my grades went downhill from there. I have a very vivid memory of my grade 5 teacher holding me after class, and I swear it echoes in my head. He said, "You're going down the tubes, boy." It's like, I swear I wake up in a cold sweat at night sometimes. But, in spite of all that, here I am, and I teach classes where I have students, active students, post-grad students, retired professors. I lecture in universities, all with barely a high school diploma. So I think it worked out.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I know exactly what you mean when you say you weren't classically trained or a traditional education. However, in another way, you are extraordinarily classically trained. If you study literature or philosophy today, you're doing a lot more contemporary works. Whereas I know the things that you've studied over the years are considered, the classic training that one would have had over the last, 30 years before us, right? So I find it kind of interesting that you have that dichotomy to your experience.
I'm full of contradictions. And to be fair, I play them up a lot because it's fun.
And it's a wonderful thing to play with contradictions and opposites. Okay, so maybe a good place to take this now is, can you give me an overview of your family's work? Maybe start with Marshall, talk about a little bit about Eric, and then yourself, where you fit into that.
Sure. One interesting thing for me is that Marshall McLuhan, when he entered the University of Manitoba, when he entered university for the first time, went in to study mechanical engineering. Yeah, and I like that because it just shows it says a lot about him. It says that he was interested in structure and how things work and components and getting down and dirty with behind the scenes. But it also resonates with me because I come at this from a different place as well, and the funny thing was his mother Elsie was an elocutionist, which back was a thing back today. She might more have been an actress or performer of some kind. That's basically what she was. But Marshall went a different direction, or tried to, by going into mechanical engineering for his first year, and the next year switched into liberal arts and followed that for the rest of his career. But and I sometimes wonder if Marshall McLuhan had stayed in mechanical engineering, what his contribution might have been. That's an interesting thought. Another interesting thought along those lines that I have is that after University of Manitoba, he got a scholarship to go to Cambridge University in England, where he studied under Richards and Leavis in English literature and criticism. But I believe it was his second choice. He actually wanted to go to Oxford, but didn't get the scholarship. And I've often wondered what if, just like if he had stayed in mechanical engineering, but more interesting, if he had gone to Oxford and studied English and literature and criticism there, which was a different approach than the new criticism or practical criticism at Cambridge.
Very different.
What would have been the difference to his later work? It's an interesting thought exercise, but
I mean, for me, the short answer is there's no way it would be the same. He's so influenced and takes what they do and really extends it so much. But this might be a discussion for another podcast.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
One thing I've learned, and this is, I think, a family tradition as well, is that there are way more ideas or little avenues to follow than any one of us have time for. So what we try to do is find grad students or interested other people that we can give these assignments to, as you know very well, because my dad gave a few to you.
He did. He did.
But yeah, things like that.
One quick note, and then I'll let you talk a little bit more about Marshall. I'm just curious if you know. Eric mentioned to me that when he did go to England to study, because he was in a relatively small university in Manitoba, they made him effectively redo his undergraduate degree.
Oh, not effectively. Yeah, they didn't recognize his bachelor degree from Manitoba.
So he said something in like a year and a half, 2 years.
Yeah.
He had already studied most of, let's just call it for short form, the canon of Western literature, and had to do it again.
Yeah.
And he credits this with one of the main reasons, I guess reasons, but one of the ways he was able to do a lot of this pattern recognition is he had to go over the whole canon again, and he was already familiar with it. So he started doing it in a slightly different way, which I always found super interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea, but that's certainly true. The credits were not transferable, not just the credits, but the degree. So they said, fine, you can do your PhD, but you've got to get a proper bachelor's degree first.
Proper
which he did.
British education.
Which he did in record time. And his doctorate work, published a few years ago as The Classical Trivium, The Place of Thomas Nash in the Learning of His Time, is just one of the most incredible, really modern works of detective work ever done. It's a wild thing. I assume you've read it, and I also assume that most people listening to this have no idea what we're talking about. But essentially, he was going to do his PhD on this Elizabethan pamphleteer Thomas Nash, but decided, and actually I'm pretty sure T.S. Eliot pointed him down this path, but he decided that in order to look at Thomas Nash properly, he had to look at Thomas Nash in his time and in his place. And when he started to do that, he discovered the inner workings of the trivium in classical education, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, and that these different schools of the word kind of were in a bit of a Cold War, sometimes a hot war against each other. So looking at that context, he decided that actually to put that context to work, he had to put the context into context, which grew the project. And he ended up going back to Cicero in the ancient Greeks, and when the trivium began, to write a history of it from Cicero up to Nash. And that became basically the thesis. But another project to do, Marshall stopped at Nash in the Elizabethans, but some grad student needs to take it from the Elizabethans up to today and follow that line. There's another job to be done. But to quickly wrap up about Marshall, what the main thing he learned at Cambridge was this approach to criticism called practical criticism, known as the new criticism over here. And essentially what it was it was a focus on effect. Richards and Leavis wanted to find out what made poetry good or bad, how to evaluate it other than through personal taste. And they ran some experiments and discovered these 4 criteria with which to judge poetry or literature on its own terms. aside from just saying, oh, that's great, or oh, that sucks. And essentially what Marshall did was take that idea and apply it to technology, and how to evaluate the effects of technology, not on its content, but structurally on its form and its effects of people on the same way. And that really tells you a lot about Marshall, because essentially a lot of his work was taking ideas, notions from other people and applying it in new ways. And that really, I think, was the main part of his genius. Not that he didn't have ideas on his own, but the way that he essentially working metaphorically, using one idea to illuminate another.
What do you know about the reasons why he makes that shift, if I can describe it as a shift? Because you've described it very eloquently, like Eric, your father, had to me in the past, that it almost seems natural. Well, you learn this thing over here and you just look at this thing over here and apply it. But especially in the time, right? Like now we're in a much more interdisciplinary milieu where this is kind of how scholarship is done.
Yep.
But at the time he's doing it, and then that kind of shift for a literature professor to then start looking at technologies with the tools of literature. What do you know about that? How did it happen? Why did it happen? Any sense you can give the audience?
Well, it's hard to say, except that it's kind of the way he and maybe we are wired. You know, that's why I let off mentioning about his going into mechanical engineering, because he was interested in structure and how things work, right? And not content to just look at a building and admire its facade or its beauty, but want to know, well, what makes it that way? What's holding it up? How's it put together, right? And that, I think that really lies at the heart of any of his explorations and investigations. But it is remarkable in the mid 1940s, when he started at University of Toronto, late 1940s, early 1950s, he gets together with Edmund Carpenter, who was an anthropologist also at the University of Toronto. And
They're you see me smile. They're my favorite duo. I love Carpenter's work. I love, and it's almost indistinguishable who's
what
writing
a tag team.
what. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and same goes with Marshall and Eric. You know, but again, this is metaphorical working, right? It's bridging, using one way to understand another, using anthropology or economics or communications to understand technology more broadly. And together they applied for and won a Ford Foundation grant. Interdisciplinary work was kind of the new hot thing, especially with regard to communication. And the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, were giving out grants left and right to do this kind of thing. They won a grant to do something in Toronto and establish something called the Culture and Communication, I think it was, seminar, where they brought together various people to discuss communication. That was how Marshall got into communication studies from English literature. And from there, he opened up the category from simply communication study to media studies. And I think that, again, was one of his main contributions to the field, was broadening the category of what we consider a medium to be not just something we use to communicate from like this, but everything from housing to clothing to forks and knives. Anything that humans do can be studied as a medium and has that kind of effect. And the wild thing is it comes out of English literature for him, which is kind of a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and I think he was definitely chastised for this back in his time for, daring to verge out of that field and into a new field. But a note on those seminars, I believe they were Monday night seminars. Am I right?
Well, that's
there?
later. That's
later.
later. Yeah,
Because he's become
later.
quite famous, right? And maybe you can speak to, just for the general audience who might not be as familiar with McLuhan, his life and his work, the kind of people that had interest in him and the work he was doing.
Yeah. So he and Carpenter did this culture and communication seminar, and another component of it was they started a journal called Explorations. And the Explorations Journal was an interdisciplinary journal with all kinds of people contributing, very well regarded and even still noted today for its groundbreaking work. But as you hinted, he wasn't chastised, is a very polite word. Interdisciplinary studies was not a thing back then. Education was very, very siloed, even more so than today. And you were expected to stay in your lane, in your field. A lot of people resented Marshall stepping out of English, even to go into communication studies, never mind to range about as he did, because he discovered that, he liked to say that understanding is not a point of view. And I think what he meant by that is that one single perspective only gives you one degree of understanding. If you want a more full understanding, you have to look at it, understand it, probe it, explore it from different angles. And each of these different arts and sciences were different ways of knowing, different ways of experiencing, can tell you different things. So that's why they started this interdisciplinary thing in the first place, and how it grew, beyond communication. One of the fascinating things to me about his work is that there was a shift in around 1954-55, and he'd published an article called An Historical Approach to the Media, where a few paragraphs in, he says how the processes at work in communication and how it affects culture are so complex that it's impossible to predict and control. And just a short few years later, in 58, 59, 60, he says the complete opposite thing, that it is possible to predict and control these things. And that to me is such a fascinating shift. And what happened was he won another grant, this time not from the Ford Foundation, but from the National Association of Educational Broadcasters. He won a grant to develop a high school curriculum for understanding new media. And he spent a year and a half going deep into the structural nature and effects of different technologies, and discovered certain things about them that led him to change his opinion, and basically led the way for the rest of his career in understanding media, which is one of the coolest things to me. That's where communication grows into media studies. That's where Understanding Media, the book, comes from. And, much of history flows from that point, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, maybe this is a good spot to talk about Marshall McLuhan and Eric McLuhan's collaboration, because I know Eric played a huge part in the research and writing of that book in particular, many others, but maybe we start there. It's,
again, the nature of Marshall's work was interdisciplinary. He was a towering figure himself, a very forceful personality, but he didn't pretend to discover all these things alone, and he certainly worked with a lot of people. He didn't work more closely with anybody but his eldest son, Eric McLuhan, who, as I said, came back from the Air Force and really dove in headfirst into this stuff. Um, I think they were really of a mind. And it's a remarkable thing. There aren't many examples of a father and son team like that, particularly in an intellectual enterprise. I can't think of another one, really. And people don't generally realize just how closely they work together. Like my work with my father was very much in an assistant and kind of student role. I'm not on their level at all. I come at it from a different way. I relate to it a different way. And my contributions are different. But my father followed Marshall's footsteps in English literature, and they really shared a brain, I think. My Eric's byline might not be on everything, but his fingerprints are all over it. And the thing is that they didn't really care too much about attribution. Dad said that over and over. It didn't matter whose name was on it. What mattered was the work. And that goes with McLuhan and Carpenter sometimes in explorations or otherwise. And it went for a lot of the McLuhan stuff from the mid-16s on. Where Marshall's ended and Eric began, or vice versa, can be almost impossible to tell. And it wasn't a meaningful difference or distinction for them, which is, again, a really interesting thing. So yeah, a lot of the later McLuhan work is McLuhan plural, certainly not just McLuhan singular. And also, again, I'm not sure the distinction really matters. It didn't matter to them. And as far as taking the work forward, I'm not sure it should matter that much to us either.
I don't think it matters insofar that there's an exploration into the dynamic that you talked about that's pretty rare, right? Like for me, that what makes it undoubtable or unquestionable that they work together, and how heavy of an influence Eric also has on Marshall. I think the other way around seems, obviously evident, right? Yeah. But to me, and you might dispute this, but Laws of Media is my favorite work. And Laws of Media is obviously published after Marshall's death. And I can see clearly the structure, talking about structuralist thinking, that Eric brings to it. Eric is at a different point in his career, younger. And I love it because it was meant to be a book for academics, which your father, Eric, told me was one of his great mistakes, he believed. I didn't agree with him because it's my favorite work.
He regretted
I just bring it up. Yeah, I just bring it up to kind of emphasize that point. It's clear to me, as someone who's read all of the work, that is so different, in part because it's Eric, doing the final assembly, and it also happens to be what I believe the most powerful of all the works.
Well, yeah, you see, if you take a survey, a bit of a zoomed out look at all that work, you see Marshall moving further away from academic form and style.
Exactly.
And you see Eric moving closely into it, with Laws of Media being the shining example of that. Why he said he regretted it was only because the more academic you make something, the narrower you make the audience. And why I think he regretted it was because the academic audience doesn't really care about this stuff. Really. I'm making a generalization, but I think that's what he was trying to get at there, is that that work in Laws of Media is, honestly, one of the greatest discoveries of the 20th century. And it deserves a wider audience than it has. And
I think that's what he thought was the regret,
exactly.
He wanted to have a broader audience, but at the same time, I told him I agreed with what his assumption was at the time, is the best way to get this further studied and researched was to get it into the hands of the academics who can then take it and see the discoveries and see the approach. And one of the most remarkable things I found in speaking with Eric was that as much as he was proud of his work, was like it obviously was his life's work, but he had no kind of false pride around it, right? It's a weird thing to say. He's proud of the work, but like he said, if someone found other laws or contradicted, like that's what he wanted. That's why they put it out to the academic audience. He wanted the ideas to be challenged. He wanted to keep thinking and pushing his thinking. And I think when the response was pretty dull, that was what made him kind of regret it a bit.
Yeah, well, he was like his father. He was an explorer, not a colonist. So that kind of stuff didn't really, for the most part, matter to him. Like awards and things that he won sit dusty and tucked away in corners of his office, not hung around the wall behind his desk or stuff like that. Like he doesn't care. I
actually never saw one.
Yeah, and he had several. That didn't matter. That didn't matter as much to him. He only cared about it in as far as it was a means to further ends. That the degrees meant that he could get taken seriously by an academic publisher like U of T Press, who published Laws of Media, and that publishing the material through an academic press meant that it had to be reckoned with on that level. You can't just dismiss it because, it's gone through that process and it's legit. Obviously, I don't care as much for that stuff. What matters, again, I think I'm more of the discovery and exploratory mindset than caring too much about the other stuff, except that it's means to ends.
Let me bring another through line between the three of you that I'd like you to kind of talk about here is, I think you're all three very committed educators. Marshall, to my understanding, almost always taught an intro course to stay close to the younger generation of students. He could have easily just taught graduate school courses. Eric taught at the Harris Institute for years, a really interesting place for him. And I not only sat in, but guest lectured with him there.
Did you?
I did. I did on acoustic ecology. I gave a little seminar, little workshop on that with him. And I see the same, obviously, in the work that you're doing, teaching understanding media. So let's pivot to that aspect of the through line as educators, the three McLuhan educators. But I think the best way to start, but please take this in any direction you want, is let's talk about the medium as the message and understanding media. So the audience here is going to be an educator audience. I don't know how familiar they will be with Marshall's work. Certainly the Canadian portion of the audience will know the name and know the aphorism. But can you maybe unpack the aphorism? And then there's another one that I always like that no one ever really quotes, user as content, which I think is so appropriate for today. So if maybe in way of talking about how you teach understanding media, help us go through those aphorisms and then talk about the work you're doing teaching the class.
Yeah. Well, when I started the McLuhan Institute half a dozen years ago, I decided to focus on the medium as the message for a couple of reasons. It's McLuhan 101. It's very basic understanding of media, of the effects of technology, but it's also extremely potent. It's a remarkable phrase. It's 5 words, the medium is the message. But there is so much to it. Marshall might have been an academic, but he was a poet. He was a deep poet. To be able to pack so much into 5 words is an act of deep poetry. There's several interesting things about it, but I've done a lot of work in tracking down the first time he ever said it, and that was in May 1958, June 1958, at a radio broadcasters conference in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
He first said the medium is the message, which is 6 years before Understanding Media came out, which is where a lot of people trace it to. He actually wrote in 1960 an in-depth essay called The Medium is the Message, where he spells it out very, very clearly. He spells it out less clearly in Understanding Media.
Although it's pretty clear.
Well, it is pretty clear.
Right? In that first paragraph, it's a pretty tight definition, right?
Very tight, but possibly too tight for a lot of people. I mentioned about the NAEB project that he did 1958 to 1960, which resulted in a report called the Report on the Project in Understanding New Media. That report didn't really go anywhere. It wasn't really used as a curriculum for high school education in understanding new media. But Marshall spent the next 4 years rewriting it over and over and basically condensing a report in very report-looking structure and language into what's more a collection of poems called Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man. And the first thing I tell people in sort of advice of how to approach that book is to approach it like you would approach a book of poetry, as simply as that. Because you don't sit down and expect to read a book of poetry from cover to cover in one sitting. And you don't expect to read it the same way you might read a work of fiction or nonfiction. You approach it very differently. You have different expectations, and you're expecting to play with the language a lot more. You're expecting to fill in a lot between the words, between the lines in a poem. And if you approach Understanding Media that way, you'll get a lot more from it, because that was, Marshall McLuhan had worked very hard to turn it from the report into more poetry in order to force you to interact with it more, to get more out of it. So that's kind of lesson one. And the medium is the message is really case in point in that, distilling down what is at once a very simple but also very complex notion. Later on, Marshall said, if I use the word environment instead of media, that would be a better choice. And if you think about it in terms of the environment is the message, it makes more sense, even if it's less pithy. So I tracked down the first time Marshall said it in 1958, and I've been collecting all the different ways he said it in between over the next essentially 30 years. And if you want to understand it, the best way to do is to look at all the different ways that he said it, and you get the idea pretty quick. But his main point about media is that the effect of them comes less from the content of the technologies than the structure and nature of it and how it creates a new environment. And it's the effect of that that makes all the difference. So with something like Zoom, for example, it's less what you and I might have a meeting, or we could be talking about dinky cars or Pokemon or media studies. But the fact that we can have this conversation separated from by a few hundred kilometers or half a world around in an instant, and what that means for work, for life, for education, has so much to do with the structure of the situation than the content of the situation. And in fact, the kind of second point to that is that the user is content, that we are really the content of any environment. And, without content, one of the easiest ways to try and understand a technology is to disregard the content. But this goes against most of the conventional approaches, like media literacy, for example. If you take away content, it doesn't have too much to say, because media literacy is all about what's essentially propaganda studies, understanding that people have agendas, political, ideological, commercial, that they're trying to force on you. And that's necessary and important. But
Legit
if you take away
area of study,
very much and needed,
necessary
understanding,
and needed, excellent,
for sure.
Yep.
But the effect of technologies don't come as much from their content, but from how they reshape us as people on a sensorial level, on a cognitive level, and how that changes our values, our preferences, our societies, our cultures.
Now, I think this is a very important point for this audience, and I just want to make sure we put a fine point on it. The difference between media literacy and media ecology. Can you help describe now? I think you did a great job of media literacy. Can you help describe the field that essentially your father and grandfather create?
Well, just as there are many media literacies, it's MIL, right? Media and information literacy, or digital media literacy, all these different things. There are also, I think, media ecologies. There are different approaches to what that means. But on one side of things, they define media ecology as the study of media as environments. On another side, my father said, media ecology is not a spectator sport. I love that line. In other words, it's not a field of study as much as a field of action, which is a very different thing. Ecology entails action. If you have a polluted lake and fish are dying, you can study it all you want, but studying isn't going to stop the fish from dying. If you want to you got to address an environmental problem if you want to change it. And the way to address it is environmentally, right? So media ecology versus it's not even versus, they're different. They're like anthropology and sociology. They're related, but they're different. Right. And they're both necessary and both have their points. But media literacy really addresses the content, and media ecology really addresses the form. So
excellent.
Another way that to look at it is that propaganda changes people's minds, and media change people.
That's beautiful. And I think for this audience in particular, I want to just let that resonate with them. Because there is a lot of media literacy, and we both have kids around the same age in elementary school, and we know that's important. The other thing that's starting to creep in is the impact of these technologies. So we're both here in Ontario, Canada, and the ministry just banned cell phone use. Many schools have been banning it because of how disruptive it was to the learning environment. Yeah. So they are living through this, big shift in media ecology that's impacting the classroom. So I think it's an important thing for educators to understand that key difference that you just pointed out. Do you have, and actually, let me go this way. So we'll kind of go from understanding media now to City as classroom, because I think, it's a big jump and there's a lot in between that we're skipping over, but for sake of time here, I do want to kind of help the educators situate why your work, your family's work is so important. I think always has been, in particular for education. So I also believe that was an NEAB report then becomes, I think, the ground from which your father, Marshall McLuhan, and Catherine Hutchin write City as Classroom.
You mentioned something about banning cell phone use in school. It's interesting because some schools are like places will ban TikTok and a place will ban cell phones. And it's almost the media literacy versus media ecology approach. And I liken it to, when a couple decades ago when they realized that smoking indoors was a bad thing, right? They would create a non-smoking section in the restaurant, right? As if that made a big difference, but this is the ecology thing, right? It's like the absurdity of just making a non-smoking section as if that's the same as having a non-smoking restaurant, right? So banning TikTok is like creating a non-smoking section in the restaurant. It's not really a great solution. On the other hand, banning smartphones from the school is like making a non-smoking restaurant. It's a better step. It's a little blunt, but it doesn't go all the way. Okay, so you ban the smartphone from the school, and that takes care of 6 hours of the day. But if you look at the statistics, which I did, the average American between 8 and 18 spends upwards of 16 hours a day on screen devices, smartphones, computers, whatever. Now, here's the catch: for non-educational purposes is how they phrase the statistic, as if if you're looking at educational content on the smartphone, it's better than if you're just watching YouTube. Well, that is to completely understand, that's to think that the content is the message, but the effect doesn't come from the content. But what can you do about it? I think, steps are good. I think we're making progress. But to your question about City's Classroom was a book Marshall and Eric McLuhan did in the later 1970s with a co-author, Catherine Hutchin, who was a high school educator. And it was another kind of kick of the can at creating a media studies curriculum for high school students. Just like the NEEB report, it didn't quite catch on. One of the main reasons for that is that the book asked a lot of questions and provided no answers. Teachers were used to textbooks where you could flip to the end and see the answer so you could mark your grades. But this was not the method of education that the McLuhans followed or that they felt was helpful in our age at getting at the answers that we want to get at.
And I also think on like page 1, it says, get out of the classroom, right? So that's a very different approach than, especially in the, late 80s, right? That it was published, or maybe
70,
earlier than that.
78, 79.
Late 70s, right?
Yeah.
Even better, late 70s, right? Where you're in like the heyday of rows and testing and, very structured classrooms.
Yeah, but the difficulty, which Marshall understood decades before, was that in the 20th century, there's more information more readily available outside the classroom than in. Given that fact, he liked to cite somebody saying that, why would I go to school and interrupt my education? The whole reason that schools started was because the opposite was true, that information was scarce and hard to obtain. So they centralized it. They put it all in one place, and you could go to university, and your choice was university or priesthood if you wanted to be educated. But that situation reversed. Most notably by the 20th century, it was a ridiculous assumption. So they instead switched to empowering students to be able to find the answers for themselves. One of the main techniques that book rests on is this thing called figure and ground. And figure and ground were terms from Gestalt psychology in the early 20th century, used to describe the structure of visible phenomena. It's how I think Edgar Rubin put it. And again, in Marshall's brilliant stroke, he took that and applied it more broadly, and instead used the terms to describe, I think you could say, invisible phenomena. So where in Gestalt terms, like, or in painting, you might think of a painted work and the figure is kind of the object of attention, and then you have a background with a frame around it. But in order to study the structure of the entire situation, you have to look even beyond the frame. So the ground, the figure becomes the area of attention, the object of study, and the ground is essentially the area of inattention. It's all the other things that make up part of the situation or environment or medium or ground. And I teach this class for kids that's developed out of Cydia's classroom. And it's I do it for as young as grades 5 and 6, and it's actually a lot of fun. Essentially, it goes like this. I go into a classroom, and I have a whiteboard or a blackboard, and we talk about the smartphone. So in the middle of the board, I'll write smartphone. And then so that's our area of attention. And I say to the kids, in order for the smartphone to work, what do you need? And this is great. 99% of the class can get involved, except for the most painfully shy or, unable to respond kind of people. Everybody can yell out electricity, batteries, you need money to buy one. You need stores, you need software, you need apps. And my job, or your job as the kind of facilitator, is to put these things on the board and start to group them together. So electricity and power and batteries and natural materials. And then you also have like research and development. You have manufacturing, mining, assembly, labor, all of these things. And you can do this for half an hour, going around the classroom and putting things on the board, showing how they relate to each other. But all these things are the environment or ground or medium of the smartphone, which are the supporting structure for this device. So you get a really full board. All these kids can relate because they all basically have one. Now the fun comes when, after you fill up this board for the last 20, 30 minutes, you erase the smartphone from the middle of it. And you say, now, kids, imagine you wake up tomorrow morning and your smartphone doesn't work, and it's not going to work again. Some catastrophe has happened. You now live in a smartphone society without smartphones. And there's a moment of silence, literally an audible gasp, because these grade 5 and 6 kids can't imagine a world without their smartphone. I say you wake up in the morning, but they probably don't wake up, right? They sleep in because they're used to waking up to their phone. They check it, notifications, they look up the weather, they look up everything, right? They book an Uber maybe, or who knows what, right? They get to the school and they're still communicating with their friends on these devices in recess, at lunch, whatever, and going home. It's what puts them to bed at night and wakes them up or doesn't in the morning. And they really cannot comprehend how to do anything without it. And then you look at this board and you look at the support structure, and what happens if you remove the smartphone from it? Well, a lot of it is so specialized that without the smartphone, it collapses. And one thing that we learned from COVID and the global lockdown is how quickly those dominoes fall. This was a really great exercise in understanding the effect of environments. And when you change things a little bit, dominoes fall, and they fall quickly and heavily. So when you take the figure out of the ground, it really shows the ground in a new light that we don't see when we're immersed in it, right? It's like the one thing the fish doesn't know anything about is water, right? Well,
I love that entire lesson prompt, because you can think after that 30 minutes, how many other projects, explorations you can do with them, right?
So then the assignment for the kids is, okay, now pick a different technology and map out the ground and then discuss the effects. So air conditioning, right? Or clothing or utensils or cups and saucers, like any of these things, you can map out the ground, and the grounds
Google
will
Classroom.
overlap between. Sure, right? Yeah, definitely. But this it's that technique of pulling the figure out of the ground. It's that audible gasp, I should say, grasp, that lets you know how dependent we've become on these things emotionally, how emotionally invested we are on these things which we take for granted. A medium is essentially something we take for granted. But, this, at the end of that little exercise, I can say to the kids, this is what is meant when you say we shape our tools and thereafter they shape us, because we create this environment and this environment creates us. And when you change this environment, you change us. And this is also what is meant when you say the medium is the message, because that is the medium. And all that happens regardless of the conversations we have, whether I'm looking up the weather or adding 10 plus 20 or whatever. These things don't happen on a content level. They happen on a medium level.
Well, thank you for that. I think that is as tangible an example you can give this audience that's going to be educators as to the medium, the message, and your work and how that looks differently in the classroom. And I don't want to suggest that they're not doing these types of things. I just want to help folks be as knowledgeable about how they're teaching this in the classroom.
For sure.
So with that, can I ask you what kind of relationship do you believe schools and school districts should have with technology?
Well, when you deliver a question like that, I hear it a certain way that maybe other people don't hear it, just because I have such a broader definition of technology. Most people, when they hear that question, they think you're asking, what do I think about smartphones in the classroom? But technology to me is as much a smartphone as it is a pen and paper. So what do I think about technology in the classroom?
Okay. I should have been more articulate with a McLuhan on this side. But actually, go ahead. Answer the question the way you're going to answer.
Well, but my answer would be the same, is that, when you understand that the environment is a shaping force and it is going to lead to a certain set of conditions, will lead to a certain kind of person, right? Understand that you shape your environment and you shape your students. So keep that in mind when you're considering your classroom. If this is your classroom, you're going to have a certain kind of student. If you have 4 walls and a blackboard and pens and papers and books, you're going to have a very different kind of student. To me, those are the strengths of the traditional classroom. And the best, the mind that is shaped by that immersion in text and in handwriting is very different from the mind that is shaped by a keyboard and a screen. One of the great quotes that Marshall liked to trot out from time to time was Truman Capote talking about Jack Kerouac's work, saying that's not writing, that's typing. And it seems some to be a silly distinction or a pedantic kind of thing, but there's all the difference in the world between writing and typing. And not just because, we don't teach cursive anymore. But
by the way, it's coming back. They're being
well, I've heard it's coming back. Yeah, but the thing is,
it's a great move.
It is a great move. It depends very much on, again, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to provide your student with? The difference between writing and typing is the difference between 40 words a minute and 80 words a minute. In my case, I type about 80 words a minute. I write about 40 words a minute. And that doesn't simply mean that I can write something faster. But, one thing a lot of people struggle with is like their mind racing and anxiety and stuff today.
Mm-hmm.
And a pretty easy hack to work on that is to write by hand. So what I suggest people do is spend 15 minutes a day writing something, something more than just random words on a paper, right? Write what you see out your window, or write a journal entry, or write a letter to your mom because she'd love to hear from you, or to your kids, or whatever else. But this analogy struck me when I was driving across the country with my wife and kids a couple of years ago. And you go through the mountains and you see these signs saying, showing the grade, and it says trucks use lower gear because when you lower the gear, you slow down the engine and you slow down the truck. And this is the effect of writing by hand at 40 words a minute, because in order to write a connected anything for 15 minutes, you have to slow down your mind, or you're just going to get gibberish. And that accumulates over, if you do that for 15 minutes a day for a couple of weeks, you're going to notice a difference. So this is what, it's not about calligraphy or penmanship or anything else. It's about the effect, So probably the number one recommendation I would have for teachers, and your kids aren't going to like it, but get them to write something, even 5 minutes in your classroom a day.
Start there.
Start.
Now, I'm kind
and
of
the other point to make about that. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
The most ridiculous thing I hear and see, and my kids are 8 and 10, and see in their classrooms, is this insane notion of teaching literacy on screens. Because the same way that your hand writes at 40 words a minute and types at 80, those are my numbers. You might be slower or faster. Mm-hmm. The eye behaves differently reading on a screen and reading on a page. And it's just as big a difference as with the hand versus writing versus typing, because it has a completely different cognitive effect. On the page, your eye and your mind behave differently than on the screen. And the benefits of literacy are the cognitive benefits and how it shapes and molds your brain. The screen, you tend to skip and skim and look for patterns, where on the page you tend to make more connections and read more fully and deeply, immersively. Very, very different things. So teaching literacy is not simply teaching people to be able to read. It's creating the habits of literacy and the reader, which is a very different thing.
And so a couple of things. I just want to point out that there's some real strong science behind this now. Some books published that we'll share. Share in the notes. I know one I spoke with your father about. I believe it was called Proust and the Squid: The Science of Reading in the Brain by Marianne Wolf.
Yeah.
But then there's been some just published within the last couple of years. They escape me right now, but I'll make sure they're in the liner notes for this podcast, because I do not believe the systems understand this clearly enough. There are lots of ways that digital technologies create efficiencies. This is not an efficiency we want. The other thing I was saying is I kind of got some tears to my eyes because you reminded me very much of your father. With those kind of insights is what he would give to me. So I love that idea. For a lot of folks that I know, just anecdotally that I'm talking to, struggle with exactly that issue. Their mind's racing, their anxiety's racing. And I love how you take your understanding of media ecology, the impact of it on the individual you want to create in the mind, and have a beautiful, simple solution, which is the kind of stuff Eric would challenge me with and propose to me all the time. So I think you are wonderfully in line with your lineage and the way you're thinking about these things and the kind of practical application. That's also the other thing that I really discovered in working with your dad over those few years is it was so much of it was driven by practical things. Yeah. One of which I still take to this day and I repeat, and it's starting to get traction, by the way, in the US and globally, but your dad was 20 years ahead of it, was one of the most fundamental things we can do, he said, was create like an FDA, like a Federal Drug Association, the state Ministry of Health or whatever it is here in Canada, to at least test technologies, think about their environments, think about their impacts, and in the very least, provide warnings. I just saw just this morning, former President Obama tweeted, texted something to that effect, that there should be warnings on tech. To me, that's an obvious thing, especially in schools can lead that way in educating not only their students in, with the example that you were talking about, but also the parent community.
It is very encouraging. I delivered a speech back in 2019, I think it was, to the law faculty at the University of Windsor in Ontario, about regulation of technology. And I looked at the case of the creation of the FDA in the States back in the early 20th century, and the Food and Drug Administration, the Food and Drug Safety Act, which is what all that grew out of. And basically what happened was people were getting sick and dying from tainted meat, canned meat, and they demanded that the government do better because there was no real oversight. It was self-regulation. And so the Food and Drug Safety Act was designed and implemented, and it stated these two main criteria: that food and drugs had to be safe and effective. In other words, they had to not kill you or make you sick, be safe, and they had to be effective in that they had to do what they said they were going to do. So no snake oil, right? None of these crazy drink this and you're going to cure your cancer. No, you can't just say that. You have to demonstrate it, and it has to not kill you. The problem with technology is that it's very difficult to measure safety and efficacy when we're rewiring people on a sensory and cognitive level. You mentioned before we started recording about Jacques Lucirand and his book, And There Was Light, which is a wonderful book. And Marshall loved it because it illustrated what he knew about the senses, which is that in Lucirand's case, he became blind at a very young age in a schoolyard accident. And he describes in wonderful detail how, as his visual faculty dimmed, his other senses perked up. His sense of hearing became more acute, his sense of touch, all his other senses filled in the blank left by the loss of his sight. And this goes to demonstrate that our senses don't exist in a vacuum, but work as a system. And to affect one sense is to affect all senses. Not only that, but we are essentially the sum of our senses. Okay. If you think about that stark contrast between somebody who can't see and somebody who can, the person who can't see doesn't care about what's behind me on this shelf, doesn't care about the color of the walls, doesn't care that I have a design on my t-shirt or that it's white or, that I have my hair cut or whatever. They have a completely different set of preferences and values because of their sensory makeup, okay, than a visual person. What Marshall discovered about technology was that we're affected not on the content level, but on the level of the technology, of the structural nature of the technology as it affects our senses. Because just as our senses exist in a balance among themselves, they are also not static things, but they change. You and I are both wearing glasses because our eyes are not as they once were. We probably add more salt and spice to our food because our sense of taste has dulled over time. Our senses change, and they atrophy over age, but they also change depending on what goes through them. They're not passive receptors. And each technology affects our senses in different ways. And when you affect one sense, you affect all senses. So this is how we shape our tools, and thereafter they shape us, because they rearrange, they modify the senses they pass through. And by modifying any one sense, you modify all your senses. And the effect is to create a new culture. It's to create people who can't see or people who can see. every time you get a new mass technology like the smartphone or writing or anything else. So this is, but how do you measure that in terms, is that safe? Is that effective? Well, it's a different, it's a different culture. Safe and effective those are not criteria through which to judge the cultural understanding. Media looks at technology in two main criteria, and that is their personal and their social effects. How technologies affect us one-on-one as on a sensory, cognitive, individual level, our identity, everything else. And by aggregate, when you get a society of blind people, how that creates a different culture, personal and social effects. And it's a much different matter to try. How do you regulate that? How do you test that? It's very difficult. And so we just ignore it and focus instead on the content, which is what we can evaluate.
To counter that a bit, the one area, or at some point I should say, you do realize that they're harmful, right? So social media, cell phones, and teenagers, like, I'm sure you've heard of the anxious generation, and the work that Jonathan Haidt did in his previous book as well. It's like the data was pretty unequivocal a while ago.
But right? harm again is a relative term, because I think about Elvis. Okay.
Yeah, depression rates, suicide rates. Like my point is, there are some numbers, there are some ways we can start looking at it, right? And even what I would suggest too is, even with the warning labels, like, we're not sure, but you might want to be cautious. Like, I think is an approach that obviously you would advocate for, right?
And it would be enough if Congress understood that the medium is the message, and understood that these things reshape us on those fundamental levels. But all of these hearings and everything else are all muddied down in content, which the tech companies are happy about, because you can argue that all day long. But the thing that gives me some measure of hope is there may just come a point when we get pissed off enough that we demand meaningful change, because we're going to realize pretty quickly that just banning TikTok or smartphones from school isn't solving the problem. And I come back again to the case of the FDA. Pfizer, Bayer, any of these large pharmaceutical companies, you better believe they fought it tooth and nail, because nobody wants to delay their product going to market. Nobody wants to incur extra expense doing it. The amount of expense a drug company has to do to get a new drug through to market is insane. However, none of them are hurting for profits. They're making money hand over fist still. And the same will apply to technology companies. Yes, it's going to mean a lot more rigorous work on the back end before they bring things out, but they're still going to make money hand over fist. So I really do believe it's inevitable, if we survive at all, that we will find ways to put some kinds of backstops. But one of the main difficulties is that innovation moves at the speed of light and regulation moves at the speed of paper.
Agreed.
That, however, is, I think, its saving grace too, and how regulation, just as its slow form, is the best backstop we have, because we need to slow things down.
So we're getting to the end of the time, but on this note, let me ask this question, because it's really one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast, is because I don't think the locus for change is going to be legislation. It's too slow. But I do think the education system writ large across North America here, which is really my focus, can be a good stopgap, because things can move faster there. And I think there's a lot of desire amongst the educators I know, amongst the superintendents I know, to be more proactive in helping their communities. So if you had a magic wand, what would you do to change the education system tomorrow?
Oh boy, that's That's a good question. I mean, so how to change anything, you know, meaningful change. Like my father and grandfather, I'm interested less in theory, uh, less than either in improving things than in doing things, right? So it's great that we have science backing up this kind of stuff. You could just try writing for 15 minutes a day and see what happens, you know, find out, mess around and find out is the polite way of saying it. Um, if we wait for governments, we're going to be waiting forever. And if we wait for change in any of the big systems, the education system or government or whatever, I think the same result. This is why Marshall McLuhan left, even though he was an English teacher for his entire career, he left the academy behind and went into the public to do this stuff because he realized that his area of efficacy was so narrow in the academy, important, but narrow, and that if you want to change the world, you've got to get out into the world. So, you know, that's why I do the teaching that I do online, guest lecturing in classes. I'm kind of the ultimate outsider insider in a funny kind of way. If I had a magic wand,
and remember, it's all powerful, right?
And it's all powerful.
Yeah, magic. You get to do whatever you want.
Well, you know, I almost can't even imagine. You know, I'm so used to thinking of what are actually achievable things, and waving a magic wand just isn't it. You know, really, probably the best thing that would happen would be if smartphones didn't work anymore. You know, it would wake people up quick. It's like what happens when the power goes out across a city for more than a couple hours. You realize pretty quickly how dependent we are on those things, and how it gets pretty medieval pretty quickly when, you know, you lose power or internet or anything else, right? I think we dodged some serious bullets with the COVID thing that could have gotten really ugly. But somehow, you know, this infrastructure held together with chewing gum and Band-Aids, and we're still here. But nobody wants a cataclysm, you know. That's right. Even though that's probably what it would take to wake us up from it. One thing I would love to do.
Part of the reason I asked the question is to get us out of our practical minded thinking, because it is my firm belief that it's going to take bold and ambitious action. And I feel, and you kind of are evidence of it, that because we've been so head down in trying to make incremental change, I think we're, as at least those of us in the education space that want to make the change, are struggling to articulate what the bold action is, even if we could do it. So let me ask you again. You have all power. Andrew is education czar for a day for Canada. What does he do?
Well, to answer the magic wand question, I think I would wave that magic wand and the teachers and administrators would disappear. Like send them to Hawaii, send them on vacation or something.
I think they would like that part of it.
And put the kids in charge. It would obviously have very mixed results, but and I actually Neil Postman wrote this book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, and some of the things he advocates for in that are things like having teachers only teach outside their discipline. So if you're an English teacher, go teach science. If you're a science teacher, teach phys ed. This is just to get people out of their habits and biases, right? And force them into the area of discovery and out of comfort, right? And that makes things a lot more dynamic and interesting.
That's interesting. I didn't think you would have gone there, but there is a big movement and an attempt to give students more agency. So you're in line with what folks are thinking, and I think we know we don't do that enough.
Well, so my understanding media class, I take students through the book cover to cover, word by word, in 36 3-hour classes. Usually takes about 18 months to do it. And I've done it. I'm on my third group right now. And that's meant close to 175 people over the last 4 years have taken this class. And this summer I'm doing a special event for them all where, because I just learned about this book, instead of teaching as a subversive activity, we're hosting a series of sessions called Learning as a Subversive Activity. And each of my students have been invited to come up with a single point, a tip, a hack for people to educate themselves in today's world. What's the number one piece of advice or interesting thing you can suggest for people to learn as a subversive activity? Because the people who take my class are from advertising, from the arts, they're current students, they're retired professors, they're people who are trying to learn something for the love or the interest or the obsession of learning it. And I think they're the people to wave that magic wand. So stay tuned for that. I'm planning on publishing the results of that thing. That'll be fun.
Well, that sounds amazing. I'd love to share that. I'll make sure it's included here too. So with that, sir, thank you. One final question. If you can recommend a book, a podcast, a music album to teachers or administrators, what would that be?
For what purpose?
You get to decide. It could be Understanding Media, which I'll recommend for you, so you can pick something else. Understanding Media is a lot of fun. Besides
Understanding Media is so much fun, and with the few things I've told you about it, you'll have a better chance at getting something from it. Marshall McLuhan's Playboy interview is great. Checking out McLuhan on YouTube or audio or video is an interesting way to experience it rather than the written form. But I'd recommend Edgar Allan Poe's Descent into the Maelstrom.
Oh, lovely choice. Lovely choice.
Yeah, that's a good one. Read between the lines on that.
Use it as a metaphor for the technological experience and how to get out of it.
Well, I wrote on my McLuhan newsletter, I wrote I serialized a thing I did called Maelstrom Escape Strategies.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, lovely. Which is all about, so you're in a maelstrom. What next?
Now what? Now what? Yeah. Well, sir, with that, thank you kindly for your time. I appreciate this, and I will make sure that the audience knows the work you're doing and how to reach you should they be interested in you connecting with them.
Thanks, Jason. It was a pleasure talking.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.